The streets buzzed with the usual city chaos, honking horns, hurried footsteps, and the hum of passing conversations. To most, it was just another busy morning. To Matthew, it was survival. He sat on a cold bench at the corner of Main Street, clutching his worn backpack. His once pristine coat was now faded and tattered, barely enough to fend off the brisk autumn air. Life had not always been this way. Matthew had once been an ordinary man with an ordinary life. He worked as a store clerk in a small grocery store and lived in a modest apartment. But a cascade of misfortunes had toppled his world. First, his job was cut during a company downsizing. Then came months of fruitless job searching, his savings draining until eviction notices replaced the bills he couldn't pay. With nowhere to go, he became just another face in the crowd, a man whose story no one cared to know. This morning, like many others, Matthew sifted through trash cans, hoping for a half-eaten sandwich or a discarded drink. He was too proud to beg and too ashamed to approach the shelters where he'd seen desperation and danger in equal measure. As he scoured the area behind a coffee shop, something caught his eye. Amid the discarded cups and wrappers lay a sleek leather wallet. It was clean, practically gleaming in the sunlight, and completely out of place in the grimy alley. Matthew picked it up and turned it over in his hands. It felt heavy, luxurious. His fingers trembled as he opened it. The first thing he noticed was the money. Hundreds of dollars in crisp bills were tucked neatly inside, more than Matthew had seen in months. For a moment, he felt his stomach tighten with temptation. He could buy food, real food, not the scraps he usually relied on. He could rent a motel room for a week, maybe even clean himself up enough to find work. But beneath the cash were several credit cards and an ID. David Carter, the name read, next to the face of a well-groomed man in his 40s. He had sharp features, a neat beard, and a confident smile. Matthew stared at the ID, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The money could solve his immediate problems, but it wasn't his. Keeping it felt wrong. He sighed, sliding the wallet into his pocket. "All right, David Carter," he muttered. "Let's find you." Finding David wasn't difficult. The ID included an address, a luxury apartment complex downtown. As Matthew approached, he felt out of place among the pristine sidewalks and polished storefronts. His unkempt appearance drew wary glances from passers-by. At the building's entrance, a doorman in a crisp uniform eyed him suspiciously. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone cold. Matthew hesitated. I found this wallet. It belongs to one of your residents." "David Carter." The doorman's gaze flicked to the wallet, then back to Matthew. "You can leave it here. I'll make sure he gets it." "No," Matthew said quickly. "I'd like to give it to him myself, please." The doorman's frown deepened, but he picked up phone. After a brief conversation, he nodded. "Mr. Carter will be down shortly. Wait here." A few minutes later, the elevator doors slid open, and David Carter stepped out. He was as polished in real life as he appeared on his ID, dressed in an expensive suit and carrying an air of authority. David's sharp eyes landed on Matthew, and his expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief. "You're the one who found my wallet?" Matthew nodded, pulling it from his pocket and holding it out. It was in an alley behind the coffee shop on 5th, everything still inside. David opened the wallet, quickly verifying its contents. When he looked up, his expression softened. "Thank you," he said. "You have no idea how much trouble you've saved me." Matthew shifted uncomfortably. "It's nothing. I just thought it was the right thing to do." David studied him for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "What's your name?" "Matthew." "Well, Matthew, I'd like to repay you." Matthew insisted that it wasn't necessary, but David wouldn't hear of it. He took Matthew to a nearby cafe where he ordered them both a full breakfast. For Matthew, who hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks, it was overwhelming. The smell of eggs and fresh coffee made his stomach growl audibly. As they ate, David began to ask questions. "What do you do, Matthew?" The question made Matthew wince. He hesitated, then admitted, "I don't do much right now. I lost my job a few years ago. Things spiraled after that." David nodded slowly. "And now?" Matthew gestured vaguely. "I get by. Barely." David leaned back in his chair, studying Matthew. "You've been dealt a rough hand," he said, "but returning this wallet proves you're honest. That's rare these days." Matthew shrugged, unsure of how to respond. David tapped his fingers on the table as if making a decision. "Listen, I run a small real estate company. We're always looking for reliable people. How about you come by my office tomorrow? Let's see if we can get you back on your feet." Matthew's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" David smiled. "Everyone deserves a second chance." The next day, Matthew arrived at David's office, a sleek, modern space buzzing with activity. He felt out of place in his worn clothes, but David greeted him warmly and introduced him to the staff. "We'll start you with something simple," David said. "A courier job. You'll be delivering documents between our properties. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work." Matthew nodded, overwhelmed with gratitude. "Thank you. I won't let you down." Over the weeks that followed, Matthew poured himself into his new role. He was punctual, polite, and eager to learn. With each paycheck, he began to rebuild his life. He rented a small room in a boarding house, bought some new clothes, and even started saving for the future. David kept a close eye on him, offering guidance and encouragement. As Matthew's confidence grew, so did his responsibilities. David began trusting him with more important tasks, including overseeing minor property repairs and assisting clients. Months turned into a year, and Matthew's transformation was remarkable. He was no longer the disheveled man wandering the street. He had become a dependable employee and a respected member of the team. But it wasn't just his work life changed. Matthew felt a deep sense of purpose for the first time in years. He began volunteering at local shelters, sharing his story and offering support to others who were struggling. One evening, as Matthew and David reviewed the week's schedule, Matthew turned to him. "Why did you give me a chance?" he asked. David leaned back, a small smile on his face. "Because someone once gave me a chance," he said. "I wasn't always successful. I struggled, made mistakes. Someone believed in me, and it changed my life. I saw that same potential in you." Matthew nodded, his gratitude deeper than words could express. Years later, Matthew stood at the front of a crowded banquet hall. He was now a senior manager at David's company, and the event was a charity gala to support homeless outreach programs, cause close to his heart. He stepped up to the podium, his voice steady as he addressed the audience. "3 years ago, I was lost," he began. "I thought I'd hit rock bottom with no way out. But one small act of kindness, returning a wallet, changed everything. It taught me doing the right thing can open doors you never imagined." As the audience erupted into applause, Matthew's gaze landed on David, who was seated in the front row, clapping with pride. Matthew smiled. He had come a long way, but he would never forget the man who had believed in him when no one else did. The bustling city streets teemed with life as pedestrians hurried past vendors, musicians, and street performers, each caught in their own world. Among the chaos, a small figure stood out, a young girl, no older than 9, with tangled hair and patched clothes, cradling a violin that looked nearly as worn as she did. Her name was Elena, and every day she positioned herself at the corner of Maple and 7th, a place where the foot traffic was heavy. Tiny hands trembled as she raised her bow, her fingers finding the strings with a familiarity that contrasted sharply with the uncertainty in her eyes. She closed them briefly, taking a deep breath before letting the first notes drift into the air. The melody that escaped was hauntingly beautiful. It floated above the noise of the street, weaving through the din of car horns and hurried conversations. Some people slowed pausing to listen, while others rushed by without a second glance. A few dropped coins or crumpled bills into the tattered case at her feet. Elena didn't look up. She couldn't. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Keep playing, sweetheart. Play like your life depends on it." And it did. Elena's life had not always been this hard. She could still remember the warmth of their small apartment, the scent of her mother's cooking, and the sound of her father's laughter as he danced clumsily to her violin playing. But those memories felt like dreams now, distant and fragile. A year ago, her father had died in a construction accident. He had been the family's sole provider, and without him, their lives had unraveled. The landlord evicted them within months, and her mother, who worked long hours cleaning offices, struggled to make ends meet. They moved into a cramped shelter, and Elena began playing her violin on the streets to help earn whatever she could. Her violin had been her father's parting gift. He had saved for months to buy it, calling it her ticket to the stars. Though it was old and worn, it was Elena's most cherished possession, and she treated it with reverence. But the streets were harsh. People weren't always kind. Some sneered at her, accusing her of being a beggar, while others ignored her completely. Still, Elena played because she knew that every coin she earned meant food on the table and a little less worry in her mother's eyes. One chilly autumn afternoon, Elena was playing Vivaldi's Winter when a tall man in a gray overcoat stopped a few feet away. He stood motionless, his piercing blue eyes fixed on her. Elena noticed him out of the corner of her eye, but kept playing, her fingers moving deftly across the strings. The man's expression was unreadable, but there was something about his presence that made her uneasy. When the piece ended, the man stepped forward and dropped a $20 bill into her case. Elena's eyes widened in disbelief. $20 was more than she usually made in a day. "Thank you, sir," she said softly, her voice tinged with both gratitude and suspicion. The man smiled faintly. "You're very talented," he said, his voice deep and measured. "Where did you learn to play like that?" "My father taught me," Elena replied, clutching her violin protectively. The man nodded thoughtfully. "What's your name?" "Elena." "Well, Elena, my name is Henry Grayson." He handed her a business card. "I'm a music producer. If you're interested, give me a call. I think you have a gift, and I'd like to help you develop it." Elena stared at the card, unsure of what to say. Henry's offer sounded too good to be true. She had heard stories of people who took advantage of kids like her. Could she trust him? "I'll think about it," she said cautiously, tucking the card into her pocket. Henry smiled again, as if sensing her hesitation. "Take your time. I'll be in town for the next few weeks." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. That evening, Elena showed the card to her mother as they huddled together in their tiny corner of the shelter. Her mother examined it carefully, her brow furrowed with concern. "Do you think he's serious?" Elena asked, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and doubt. Her mother sighed. "I don't know, sweetheart. There are kind people in the world, but there are also those who take advantage. We have to be careful." Elena nodded, though disappointment gnawed at her. She wanted to believe that Henry was genuine, that someone saw value in her music beyond the coins tossed into her case. For the next few days, she continued playing on the streets, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Henry's offer. Finally, after much deliberation, her mother suggested they meet him in a public place to learn more. The following Saturday, Elena and her mother met Henry at a small cafe near the park. He greeted them warmly and offered to buy them lunch, but her mother politely declined. As they sat at a corner table, Henry explained his background. He had worked in the music industry for over 20 years, helping young talents refine their skills and launch their careers. "I'm not offering a shortcut," Henry said, his tone serious. "You'll have to work hard, but I believe you have something special, Elena. With the right guidance, you could do great things." Her mother remained wary. "And what do you get out of this?" she asked bluntly. Henry didn't flinch. "I'm a businessman, so yes, I see potential for profit, but I also love music. I believe in nurturing talent, and Elena's playing moved me in a way I haven't felt in years." Elena listened intently, her heart pounding. She glanced at her mother, who was deep in thought. Finally, her mother nodded. "We'll give it a try, but if anything feels wrong, we walk away." "Agreed," Henry said with a smile. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Henry arranged for Elena to take lessons with a renowned violin instructor, a kind woman named Mrs. Patel. At first, Elena was intimidated by the elegant studio and the polished students who practiced there, but Mrs. Patel quickly put her at ease. "You have raw talent, my dear," Mrs. Patel said after their first lesson, "but talent alone isn't enough. We'll work on your technique and expand your repertoire." Elena threw herself into her lesson, practicing for hours each day. Henry visited frequently, offering encouragement and occasionally bringing small gifts, new strings for her violin, sheet music, and even a sturdy case to replace her old one. As her confidence grew, so did her passion for music. She began to dream of performing on grand stages, of sharing her melodies with the world. 6 months later, Henry arranged for Elena to perform at a local charity event. It was her first time playing for an audience beyond the streets, and she was both excited and terrified. The venue was a small theater, its stage bathed in warm light. As Elena stepped into the spotlight, her hands trembled. She glanced at the crowd, searching for her mother's face. When she found it, smiling and full of pride, she took a deep breath and began to play. The notes poured out of her violin, filling the room with a depth of emotion that silenced the audience. She played with a vulnerability and passion that came from her heart, drawn from the struggles and joys of her young life. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Elena felt a rush of exhilaration, her fears melting away. Over the next year, Elena's life transformed. She performed at more events, gaining recognition and earning enough money to move out of the shelter with her mother. Henry became not just her mentor, but a trusted friend, guiding her career and helping her navigate the complexities of the music world. But Elena never forgot where she came from. She often returned to the streets where she had once played, not to perform, but to give back. She donated her earnings to shelters and started a program to provide music lessons to underprivileged children. One day, as she walked past her old corner on Maple and 7th, she saw a little boy with a battered guitar, strumming clumsily but with determination. Elena knelt beside him, offering a gentle smile. "Keep playing," she said, placing a $20 bill in his case. "Play like your life depends on it. You never know who might be listening." The boy looked up at her, his eyes wide with gratitude and wonder. As Elena walked away, her violin case slung over her shoulder, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Her journey had come full circle, and she knew that music, her father's ticket to the stars, had truly changed her fate. The waiting room of St. Matthew's Hospital was filled with the usual hustle, anxious families, tired nurses rushing between stations, and the low hum of a television playing the news in the background. Among the crowd sat an elderly man, his clothes worn and patched, clutching his chest as beads of sweat trickled down his forehead. His hands trembled as he leaned on a wooden cane that looked as old as he was. His name was Samuel, and today marked the third time in a month he had made the long walk to the hospital, hoping to find relief for the pain in his chest. Each time he had been turned away. He was too poor to afford proper insurance and too proud to beg. But today, the pain was worse than ever. It clawed at him with every breath, and he knew he couldn't hold out much longer. When his name was called, Samuel rose slowly, his cane tapping against the tiled floor as he made his way to the examination room. He was greeted by a young nurse with kind eyes who helped him into a chair. "The doctor will be with you shortly, Mr. Samuel," she said, offering a reassuring smile before stepping out of the room. Samuel nodded, clutching his chest as he whispered a silent prayer. Minutes later, the door swung open and Alan Kendrick stepped in. He was a tall, impeccably dressed man in his early 40s with sharp features and an air of authority. His reputation as one of the best cardiologists in the city preceded him, but so did his reputation for being cold and detached. Dr. Kendrick barely glanced at Samuel as he reviewed the clipboard in his hand. "Mr. Samuel, is it?" "Yes, sir," Samuel replied, his voice trembling. "I've been having terrible pain in my chest. It's been going on for weeks, and—" Dr. Kendrick held up a hand, cutting him off. "Do you have insurance, Mr. Samuel?" Samuel hesitated, lowering his gaze. "No, sir, but I can pay you in installments. I just need—" "I'm sorry," Dr. Kendrick said briskly, setting the clipboard down. "This hospital doesn't offer charity services. If you can't pay up front, I suggest you visit a free clinic. There's one across town that might be able to help." Samuel's heart sank. "Please, doctor, I don't think I can make it to another clinic. The pain—" Dr. Kendrick sighed, clearly impatient. "I understand, but this is a private hospital. We can't afford to take on cases without proper compensation." He turned to leave, but Samuel's weak voice stopped him. "Doctor," Samuel said, his eyes pleading, "I know I don't have much, but I used to be someone too. Please help me." Dr. Kendrick hesitated, glancing back at the frail man before him. For a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes, pity, perhaps, but it was quickly replaced by indifference. Without another word, he walked out, leaving Samuel slumped in the chair, his hope fading. As Samuel struggled to rise from the chair, clutching his cane for support, the nurse who had greeted him earlier rushed back into the room. "Mr. Samuel, are you all right?" she asked, concern etched on her face. "I'll be fine," Samuel lied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll find another way." The nurse bit her lip, clearly torn. "Wait here," she said firmly, before hurrying out of the room. Samuel watched her leave, feeling a mixture of gratitude and despair. He didn't want to be a burden, but he didn't know how much longer he could endure the pain. Dr. Kendrick, meanwhile, was in his office, preparing for his next appointment. He glanced at the framed certificates and awards on his wall, reminders of his accomplishments and the sacrifices he had made to achieve them. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a call from his secretary. "Dr. Kendrick," she said, her tone urgent, "there's a man here who insists on seeing you. He says it's a matter of life and death." Dr. Kendrick frowned. "Is it about that Samuel fellow?" "Yes," she admitted. "But send him away," Dr. Kendrick said curtly, ending the call. Unbeknownst to Dr. Kendrick, the nurse had taken it upon herself to call for help. She dialed the number of the hospital's director, an older man named Dr. Philip Carson, who had been a mentor to many of the younger doctors, including Kendrick. When Dr. Carson arrived at the hospital, he immediately sought out Dr. Kendrick, his expression a mix of disappointment and resolve. "Alan," Dr. Carson said, stepping into his office without knocking. Dr. Kendrick looked up, startled. "Dr. Carson, what brings you here?" "I heard about Mr. Samuel," Dr. Carson said bluntly. "Why did you refuse to treat him?" Dr. Kendrick sighed. pinching the bridge of his nose. "With all due respect, sir, this hospital is not a charity. We have bills to pay, and taking on patients who can't afford treatment puts a strain on our resources." Dr. Carson's eyes narrowed. "Do you remember why you became a doctor, Allen? It wasn't for the money or the prestige. It was to save lives. Have you forgotten that?" "I haven't forgotten," Dr. Kendrick replied, his voice defensive. "But we have to be practical." Dr. Carson stepped closer, his voice lowering. "Practicality doesn't excuse a lack of compassion. That man is suffering, and you have the skills to help him. If you don't, you'll regret it." Dr. Kendrick opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time in years, he felt a twinge of doubt. Dr. Kendrick sat in silence long after Dr. Carson had left. The older man's words reverberated in his mind, stirring memories he had buried deep. He thought back to his early days in medical school when he had been brimming with passion and a genuine desire to help others. Somewhere along the way, that fire had been overshadowed by ambition and the harsh realities of running a private practice. He shook his head, brushing off the pang of guilt. "I did what I had to do," he told himself. "The system isn't built to save everyone." As the evening wore on, the hospital grew quieter, the bustling halls giving way to a subdued hum. Dr. Kendrick prepared to leave for the night, his coat draped over one arm and his briefcase in hand. He walked past the waiting room where he saw Samuel still seated, his frail body hunched over and his breathing labored. The sight made Kendrick hesitate. The man looked so vulnerable, so defeated. For a fleeting moment, Kendrick considered turning back, but then Samuel glanced up, their eyes meeting briefly. Dr. Kendrick felt an uncomfortable tightening in his chest. He quickly averted his gaze and walked out the door. Meanwhile, Samuel sat in the waiting room, feeling more alone than ever. The nurse had returned earlier, offering him water and a blanket, but there was little else she could do without a doctor's approval. Samuel leaned heavily on his cane as he tried to stand, wincing as a sharp pain shot through his chest. "Please, God," he whispered, his voice cracking, "just let me make it home." The streets outside the hospital were dimly lit, the glow of street lamps casting long shadows across the pavement. As Dr. Kendrick reached his car, he spotted a commotion near the hospital entrance. Two security guards were rushing toward a figure collapsed on the sidewalk. Dr. Kendrick's pulse quickened as he recognized the man. It was Samuel. Instinct took over. Dropping his briefcase, Kendrick sprinted back toward the hospital, shouting for a gurney. The guards stepped aside as he knelt beside Samuel, who was clutching his chest and gasping for air. "Mr. Samuel, can you hear me?" Kendrick asked, his voice urgent. Samuel's eyes fluttered open, filled with pain and fear. It hurts," he wheezed. "You're having a heart attack," Kendrick said, assessing the situation quickly. "Stay with me. We're going to help you." Within moments, a team of nurses arrived with a gurney. Kendrick helped lift Samuel onto it, barking orders as they rushed him inside. "Get him to the cath lab," Kendrick instructed. "We need to open the blockage immediately. Prep for an angioplasty." The staff moved with precision, their respect for Dr. Kendrick evident in the way they followed his lead. In the operating room, Kendrick worked tirelessly, his hands steady as he guided the catheter to clear the blockage in Samuel's artery. Time seemed a blur as he focused on the task, his earlier doubts and frustrations replaced by determination. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the procedure was complete. Samuel's heartbeat stabilized, and his breathing eased. Dr. Kendrick stepped back, his gloved hands trembling slightly. He looked down at Samuel, who was still unconscious, and felt a wave of relief mixed with shame. He had almost let this man die. Several hours later, Samuel was resting in a recovery room, his color gradually returning. Dr. Kendrick sat at his bedside, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. When Samuel stirred and opened his eyes, Kendrick leaned forward. "You're going to be okay, Mr. Samuel," he said softly. Samuel blinked, his expression one of confusion and gratitude. You saved me. Dr. Kendrick nodded. Yes, and I'm sorry it took me so long to do the right thing. Samuel reached out weakly, his hand trembling. Kendrick hesitated before taking it, the simple gesture humbling him in a way he hadn't expected. Thank you, Samuel said, his voice barely audible. Dr. Kendrick sat in silence for a long moment, holding Samuel's frail hand. The gratitude in the man's eyes pierced through the layers of pride and detachment that Kendrick had built around himself over the years. You're welcome, Kendrick finally said, his voice soft, but I owe you an apology. I almost let my arrogance get in the way of helping you. Samuel gave a faint smile, his lips trembling as he spoke. I don't hold it against you, Doctor. Sometimes we all forget what matters most. The words struck a chord in Kendrick. He hadn't realized just how far he had strayed from the ideals that had once guided him. The satisfaction he used to feel when saving lives had been replaced by a cold focus on the bottom line. But Samuel's ordeal had shaken something loose, and for the first time in years, Kendrick felt like a doctor again, not just a businessman. I want you to rest, Kendrick said, gently placing Samuel's hand back on the bed. You'll need time to recover, but we'll take care of you. That's a promise. The next morning, Kendrick met with the hospital's administration to discuss Samuel's case. He explained the situation and advocated for the hospital to cover Samuel's treatment costs under its charity care program. The administrator, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, frowned as she reviewed the paperwork. Dr. Kendrick, we've discussed the limitations of this program before. Our resources are stretched thin, and we can't make exceptions for every case. This isn't just any case, Kendrick interrupted, his voice firm. Mr. Samuel nearly died because he couldn't afford treatment. If we can't help someone like him, then what are we even doing here? The administrator looked taken aback. Kendrick's reputation for being aloof and detached made this sudden passion all the more surprising. After a moment of silence, she nodded. I'll approve it this time, but we need to find long-term solutions for cases like this. We will, Kendrick said, and for the first time in years, he meant it. Over the next week, Kendrick visited Samuel daily, checking on his recovery and ensuring he received the care he needed. Their conversations grew more personal, and Kendrick learned about Samuel's life before he had fallen on hard times. I used to be a teacher, Samuel shared one afternoon, his voice steadying as his strength returned. Taught math at the local high school for 30 years. I loved those kids like they were my own. What happened? Kendrick asked, genuinely curious. Samuel's gaze grew distant. After I retired, my wife got sick, cancer. We spent everything we had on her treatments, but she didn't make it. After that, I just couldn't keep up with the bills. Lost the house, lost everything. Kendrick felt a lump in his throat. Samuel's story was a stark reminder of how fragile life could be, how quickly everything could change. I'm sorry, Kendrick said, his voice quiet. Samuel smiled faintly. Life has its way of humbling us, doesn't it? But I'm still here, still fighting. And now, thanks to you, I've got a little more time to keep going. Samuel's recovery became a turning point not just for him, but for Kendrick as well. The experience reignited something in the doctor, a sense of purpose he had long forgotten. Kendrick began taking on more pro bono cases, using his influence to expand the hospital's charity care program. He also volunteered at free clinics on weekends, reconnecting with the community and building relationships with patients who might otherwise have been overlooked. His colleagues noticed the change, though some were skeptical at first. Are you trying to win a humanitarian award or something? one surgeon joked during a lunch break. No, Kendrick replied with a small smile. I'm just trying to be the doctor I was meant to be. Months passed, and Samuel's health continued to improve. On the day he was discharged, Kendrick walked him to the front doors of the hospital where the same nurse who had initially helped Samuel waited with a wheelchair. Thank you, doctor, Samuel said, his eyes glistening with tears. You've given me more than my life back. You've given me hope. Kendrick knelt beside the wheelchair, his hands resting on Samuel's. It's you who gave me something, Samuel. You reminded me why I became a doctor in the first place. As Kendrick stood and watched Samuel leave, a sense of fulfillment washed over him. He knew there would still be challenges ahead, but he also knew that he was ready to face them with compassion, humility, and a renewed commitment to his calling. The story of Dr. Kendrick and Samuel became a source of inspiration throughout the hospital. It was a testament to the power of second chances, not just for patients, but for doctors as well. Kendrick had learned that true healing wasn't just about treating physical ailments. It was about seeing people, understanding their struggles, and doing whatever it took to make a difference. And in that realization, he found something he hadn't felt in years: peace. The fire roared like a living beast, consuming the old apartment building with terrifying speed. Smoke billowed into the night sky, and the air was thick with the acrid scent of burning wood and plastic. Clara sat huddled near the alley where she usually spent her nights, her thin coat wrapped tightly around her to fend off the biting cold. She had become accustomed to the noise and chaos of the city, but something about this fire made her uneasy. It wasn't just the flames or the shouts of the crowd gathering on the street. It was the sound of a baby's cries. Clara's head shot up, her heart pounding. The cries were faint but unmistakable, cutting through the din of sirens and shouting. She scanned the crowd, expecting to see someone running with a child in their arms, but no one seemed to notice. The sound was coming from inside the building. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. She dropped the threadbare blanket she'd been clutching and sprinted toward the building's entrance. "Ma'am, you can't go in there," a firefighter shouted, but Clara ignored him. The heat hit her like a wall as she stepped inside. Smoke filled the air, making it hard to see and even harder to breathe, but the cries grew louder, guiding her like a beacon. She climbed the stairs, each step a battle against the suffocating heat and her own rising panic. On the third floor, she found the source of the cries. Tiny baby girl lying in a crib, her face red and streaked with tears. Clara's chest tightened. She didn't hesitate. Grabbing a blanket draped over the side of the crib, she wrapped the baby tightly and held her close. "It's okay, little one," Clara murmured, her voice hoarse from the smoke. "I've got you." The journey back down was harrowing. The smoke was thicker now, and Clara stumbled more than once, clutching the baby desperately. Just when she thought her legs might give out, she burst through the building's entrance and into the cold night air. The crowd erupted into cheers as paramedics rushed toward her. "She's safe!" Clara gasped, handing the baby over to one of the paramedics. A woman's scream cut through the chaos. "Julia! Oh my God, Julia!" Clara turned to see a woman running toward the paramedics, her blonde hair disheveled and her face pale with panic. Relief flooded the woman's features as she took the baby into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Clara's breath caught. She recognized the woman instantly, Rebecca. Rebecca held the baby tightly, her tears soaking into the child's blanket. "Julia?" she whispered over and over, as if saying the name would anchor her to reality. Clara watched from a distance, her heart pounding. It had been years since she'd last seen Rebecca, but the memories came rushing back as if no time had passed. Rebecca had been her closest friend once, back when life was simpler, back when Clara had a job, a home, and hope. Rebecca's gaze suddenly shifted, landing on Clara. Her eyes widened in shock. "Clara!" Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to turn and disappear into the crowd, but her feet refused to move. "Hello, Rebecca," she said, her voice flat. Rebecca approached cautiously, still holding Julia. "I can't believe it's you," she stammered. What are you doing here?" Clara gestured to the burning building. "Saving your kid, apparently." Rebecca flinched at the bitterness in Clara's tone. "I didn't know you were still in the city," she said softly. Clara shrugged. "Where else would I go?" Before Rebecca could respond, a paramedic intervened, insisting that Clara sit down and take some oxygen. Rebecca watched silently as Clara was led to the back of an ambulance, her expression unreadable. Later that night, Clara sat on the ambulance's back step, the oxygen mask resting in her lap. The fire had been extinguished, and the crowd had dispersed, leaving the street eerily quiet. Rebecca appeared again, this time without Julia. "She's with my husband," Rebecca explained, as if reading Clara's unspoken question. "He's calming her down." Clara nodded, but said nothing. Rebecca hesitated, then sat down beside her. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You saved her life." Clara gave a bitter laugh. "Just doing my part, I guess." Rebecca frowned. "Clara, why didn't you tell me?" Clara interrupted, her voice sharp. Rebecca stiffened. "Tell you what? About her." Clara's eyes burned with unshed tears. "About Julia. Why didn't you tell me she existed?" Rebecca looked down, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I didn't know how," she admitted. "You were gone, Clara. No one could find you." Clara's hands clenched into fists. "You didn't try hard enough." Rebecca's voice broke. "I thought I was helping. Social services were going to put her in foster care. I couldn't let that happen, Clara. Couldn't." Clara turned away, unable to look at her. "You had no right," she whispered. "I know," Rebecca said, her voice trembling. "I know I should have done things differently, but it's not too late, Clara. We can fix this. You can be part of her life." Clara didn't respond. She couldn't trust Rebecca, not after this. But as much as she wanted to walk away, she couldn't stop thinking about Julia. In the weeks that followed, Clara and Rebecca began an uneasy truce. Rebecca brought Julia to see Clara regularly, giving them time to bond. Clara cherished every moment with her daughter, but each visit also brought a fresh wave of pain. Julia didn't know Clara as her mother. She knew Rebecca. One afternoon, as Clara sat with Julia on her lap, Rebecca approached with a folder in hand. "I've been talking to a lawyer," she said carefully. Clara's stomach dropped. "About what?" Rebecca sat down beside her. "About legal guardianship. I want to make sure you have rights, Clara. Julia deserves to know you as her mother." Clara stared at her, searching for any sign of deceit, but Rebecca's expression was earnest. "I don't want to take her from you," Rebecca continued. "I just want to do this the right way." Clara hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Okay, let's do it." The legal process was long and fraught with tension. There were arguments, tears, and moments when Clara thought about giving up. But each time she looked at Julia, she found the strength to keep going. Eventually, they reached an agreement, shared custody. Clara would have Julia on weekends, with the possibility of more time as she continued to stabilize her life. Months turned into a year, and Clara's life began to transform. With the help of the shelter, she secured a small apartment and found steady work. Rebecca and Nathan supported her, providing childcare when she needed it, and including her in Julia's milestones. It wasn't the life Clara had imagined, but it was hers, and for the first time in years, she felt hope. As Clara tucked Julia into bed one evening, the little girl reached out and touched Clara's face. "Mommy," she said softly. Clara's heart swelled. "Yes, baby, Mommy's here."